Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. Today is June the 15th, 2026. It is the anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta, which was signed on June 15, 1215. So that's about 811 years ago by King John of England at Runnymede near Windsor. The Magna Carta, most people who have taken any course in government have heard of as the seminal document lays the foundation of modern constitutional democracy. It's interesting that it was signed between the king and his barons. At the time, most of England, that's about 80% of people in England, were not free. They were actually serfs bound to their barons, and only about 20% of the British population at the time were could be considered free men who lived in they either lived in the towns or they were barons and members of the royal family. But importantly, uh, it was the barons, right? The barons were trying to limit the power of the king. And the important principle that we know that we got from the Magna Carta is that nobody is above the law, right? Equality before the law. That not even the king and his government are above the law. At that time, the king of England was an absolute monarchy. All powers, resided in him. He was he was the executive. He was the legislative arm of government. He was the judiciary. Everything, reposed in his person, um, and everything else was just a rubber stamp body. So importantly, you know, principles that have come, that we've derived from the Magna Carta include, you know, the impartiality of the courts, right? The impartiality of the courts, and the notion that uh, even the accused has rights to swift and impartial justice. Habeas corpus is a very important tool in the law that's considered to have uh, you know been derived from this foundational document, the Magna Carta. Habeas corpus. I've done a video discussing habeas corpus. That's literally means produce the body to the courts to be examined. So anybody who's been arrested, it tries to preclude prolonged unlawful detentions. So anybody who's been uh, arrested, they have a right to appear before a judge, within a certain time frame, and to plead their innocence before, at least to plead their cause before a judge. Now, the again, at the time, historically, the people who were involved with the Magna Carta were the king's barons, right? The aristocrats, the barons, and some bishops, right? In fact, the Magna Carta was actually drafted by the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time. Stephen Langton was his name. So, back then in 1215, the king again was an absolute monarch, and the kings of England were in the habit of arresting people, especially their barons, like barons who had money. If he needed money, the king could arrest a baron, imprison him, and then accuse him of false charges. It could be treason, attempts to overthrow his government. You could accuse him of anything, right? And the imprisoned person, the accused person, didn't have rights. And I'm talking about the barons, because it was the barons who went and basically, you could say they were petitioning the king, but really they were holding him captive because there was an impasse between the king and his barons. And of course, um, the aristocrats. So then the king could just accuse his barons of false charges, any charge, and then he would resolve the matter by asking for a bribe, right? No, not a that okay, he would demand payment, right? If they paid him money, then they could be released, right? So that's so the the notion, the principle of the impartiality of the courts, right? That people, courts aren't constituted to to not to follow proceedings under fabricated charges, bogus charges, just to seek a bribe, right? And that bribes and shouldn't be part of a constitutional democracy. So that's very significant. So as I said, while there are a number of foundational principles that have become part of our modern constitutional democracy, including that nobody is above the law, right? The rule of law. So you hear it all the time, rule of law, and historians, legal scholars like to trace that notion of rule of law to the foundational document of the Magna Carta, that nobody is above the law, that not even the king, that even the king and his government are subject to the law, right? And then, the equality before the law. This was just academic because, again, back then, 80% of England were not free. And interestingly, the principles, the agreements under the Magna Carta were shelved, they were put aside. In fact, the document I think, was even abrogated. It would take, decades for later kings, including Edward III, to again reconvene with the barons. And, again, there was a back and forth, the ebbs and flow, the pendulum swings. The kings basically put it aside, ignored it. And of course, it eventually led to the regicide of King Charles I on January 30, 1649, by Oliver Cromwell and his cronies. That's the radical Puritans and military faction that would create the Commonwealth between 1649 and 1660. That period of England is known as the interregnum. It was when England was actually a republic. So England was a republic before the United States, very briefly, albeit. But interestingly, back to the period of the Magna Carta. Interestingly, the rights that were negotiated at the time included church rights. So they were advocating. Of course, it was drafted by a churchman. Again, that's the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time. So the church was very significant in the development of law, right? Canon law and all of those things. The law, as we know it, came later on, and the courts. It was today in America we have the benefit of the separation of powers, right? We have an executive arm with the president and his executive and his cabinet. We have the judiciary, with the judges. And then we have the notion of an independent judiciary. And then, of course, we have the legislative arm of government, which is Congress, who make the laws. And that's what we have in America. And, of course, several other nations have it. Again, we owe a lot, of course, of our constitutional democracy as we have it today to England, right? But interestingly, the provisions of the Magna Carta were, they were set aside. But the notion that the king was being challenged, that the absolute power of the king as judge, as jury, as executioner, and that the idea that he could use the law, right, as a tool to extort, his subjects or his barons. In this case, his barons. Again, the king could just accuse his barons, imprison them, hold them until they paid him a bribe, right? He could accuse them of anything and hold them until they paid him a bribe. But other, provisions that came out from the Magna Carta were church rights as well, because it wasn't just the barons. So the people, the heads of the church, because again, I've done videos in which I explain the aristocracy of Europe, which was called the Ancien regime, of course, which was overthrown in France with the French Revolution. And England still kept modified structures of this aristocracy. The church, the bishops, the heads of the church were a huge part of that class structure, right? There was a king, and then there were the nobles, and then there were the commoners or the peasants at the bottom. But you see how the Magna Carta helped to evolve notions of rights. This is very, very important. Notions of rights. Now, it is ironic that the Magna Carta established the rule of law, impartiality of the courts. Right? No one, not the king, not his government, is above the law. Equality before the law. Now, America that has touted itself as a bastion of modern constitutional democracy is evolving, is changing. We're seeing that a cabal is now capturing governments. There's state capture now. There's a cabal. I know because I worked for the federal government, and I've had false charges against me. False charges, bogus charges. I haven't had a trial. I was detained for 450 days. You can imagine, on bogus, spurious charges, and with the purpose of trying to discredit me and to extort me. The very thing that the barons were accusing the King of England of 811 years ago. That look, this is not justice. The Department of Defense now uses as national security. It has rogue leaders, rogue senior leaders that have now become above the law. They're now acting above the law. They're now criminals. We see the case of David J. Rush, right? How an unqualified fraudster entered and became a member of the senior executive of the CIA. That's because there's now a rogue cabal in the government, in the US federal government, and they have states like the state of Maryland. DC is where our seat of government is. The state of Maryland, DC is carved out of the state of Maryland and Virginia. So its environment, so governments around the national government are corrupted easily, right? They've now become appendages of the Department of Defense, and the federal government. The Department of Defense is half federal government, right? It's huge. You can see from the budget, the size of the budget, and of course the people that are employed by the Department of Defense. On May 16, 2023, I was raided on a swatting. I've done videos discussing what a swatting is, a false flag operation, a fabricated emergency, was supposed to have taken place. It was all staged, and I was removed from my home, literally kidnapped by Montgomery County Police that have become rogue agents of the Department of the Navy. I filed a complaint. That's my constitutional rights based on whistleblower protection, right? If we see fraud, if you're a government employee, federal government employee, you're supposed to report fraud. You have a duty, constitutional duty, to report fraud, waste, mismanagement, misconduct. There are channels, and I followed those legal channels. But in violation of RICO laws, somehow there was a retaliation. That's a violation of whistleblower law. And then, and also, by the way, I filed a discrimination complaint, a harassment complaint. But somehow there was a retaliation, and Montgomery County police officers raided me, spread disinformation, and then Montgomery County State Attorney, the crooked State Attorney John McCarthy, right? He has a name that sounds, I guess maybe he has Irish descent, so shame on him. His office filed false charges against me which it had no intention, no ability to prosecute or obtain a conviction. For over 3 years now, these false charges were filed with the sole purpose of extorting, blackmailing me, and obstructing justice, right? Or precluding my EEOC complaints, my Office of Inspector General complaints, to discredit me and to use it to extort me, right? Over 3 years. So all of this is in violation of the rule of law, the impartiality of the courts. There's a judge, Judge James Bonifant, who's been bribed. There was a private attorney who tried to extort me, sought a bribe on behalf of the state of Maryland to make the case go away, right? So John McCarthy is a crooked state attorney. He files false charges and he tries to use plea bargains, right, to resolve a matter. False charges, they fabricate evidence, they pull false witness, false accusations, just back to the time of medieval England, that caused the barons to put the king, sit him down, and the bishops, they sat him down and made him sign the Magna Carta, that you can't have these false imprisonments. The king, the government is not above the law. Their rights, people subject, the king's subjects have rights. We thought this was a foregone conclusion as part of our American democracy when the Declaration was declared in 1776. Right, we're going to be 250 years old in less than a month, but we have a rogue state, rogue agents operating in Maryland, from Montgomery County, Maryland, a rogue state attorney, a crooked state attorney, John McCarthy, whose office files false charges, he abuses his office to extort minorities, black people, law-abiding government officials, government employees like myself. And he connives with rogue cops, right? Like Damarcus Coleman, Sergeant Charles Drengwitz, and I guess he's retired now, Marcus Jones, who was chief of police at the time. So they use false charges in Montgomery County, Maryland, and they have crooked judges like Judge James Bonifant, who was circuit administrative judge, and of course Judge Bibi, who files. They use various pretexts, right? They use fraudulent emergency evaluation petitions. They use all these, they use a kaleidoscope of lies, invidious mechanisms to violate the principles of the rule of law and the constitutional rights of Americans. And we established those principles that the government is not above the law, that individuals have rights. We established these principles, enshrined them in the amendments in our Bill of Rights, right? Drafted by James Madison. In any event, I want to keep this video short. I've done videos explaining the violations of the rule of law by John McCarthy and Montgomery County and crooked judges like Judge James Bonifant and Judge Bibi. They create a bunch of false witnesses who file false accusations. They use ex parte orders. Ex parte orders are basically, they're typically obnoxious in the law because it's one side, right? It's one side that's being heard before a court, and it's in violation of the Sixth Amendment in the Constitution, where the accused has a right to be heard, right? The principle of natural justice, audi alteram partem, that you should hear the other side as well. No one's heard my side, and they've just created all these fabrications just to obstruct justice in a fraud case in the Department of the Navy and Department of Defense, where rogue agents like Kendra Ortiz, Nathan R. Brown, and a Nefertari McBride, and the Auditor General, Donjed L. Gilmore, Kirsten Risbeck, Jamie A. Simon, all these people, that's from the Department of Defense, they commit fraud in violation of principles of the rule of law. My name's Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.